My chest still heaved from running, my legs heavy with exhaustion. The school loomed behind me like a shadow of some ancient predator, but I had made it out. I had escaped. The bus doors hissed shut, and the driver, an old man with a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face, didn't even glance at me. The bus lurched forward and I slumped into the nearest seat, the cheap plastic groaning under my weight. The windows were fogged over, but as I wiped the glass, the outside world was wrong. Instead of familiar streets, a pale fog had swallowed everything. No landmarks, no trees, just a shapeless void stretching infinitely on either side of the bus. I turned to the other passengers. Most of them were students, but something about them was off. They sat too still, their faces pale, their eyes empty. One girl stared at me, her lips trembling as if she wanted to speak but couldn't. The air felt heavy, suffocating. A faint hum vibrated through the bus, crawling under my skin. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself I was just tired, but the hum grew louder, morphing into whispers. The bus jolted, and my head snapped forward. I looked out the window again, and my heart sank. The fog had thickened, pressing against the glass like a living thing. I couldn't see the road anymore. The whispers turned into faint cries, a chorus of voices overlapping. I turned to the girl again, but her seat was empty now. In her place was a school bag, old and frayed, with a name tag I recognized. It belonged to a student who had vanished years ago. The seat across from me creaked, and I glanced over. A boy sat there now, his head hung low, his hands clutching a torn notebook. He looked vaguely familiar. Another missing student? His head snapped up and his eyes locked on mine. They were black, endless voids. I jumped up and stumbled down the aisle. Every seat I passed seemed occupied now, filled with students I knew but hadn't seen in years. Their faces were pale, gaunt, their lips twisted into half-formed words. The bus driver hadn't moved. His hat remained tilted forward, his hands gripping the wheel as if he were carved from stone. I reached for his shoulder, but a cold hand gripped my wrist. It was the boy with the notebook. He shook his head slowly, his empty eyes pleading. Then he pointed to the floor. I followed his gesture and saw faint etchings, symbols carved into the metal. They pulsed faintly, like veins carrying blood. I yanked my arm free and stumbled back to my seat. My legs felt weak, like they didn't belong to me anymore. The whispers grew louder, forming words I couldn't understand. They weren't in any language I recognized. The bus slowed, its brakes screeching, and I pressed my face to the window, desperate to see where we were. A shadow loomed in the fog, growing clearer with every second. My stomach churned as I recognized it, the silhouette of the school. No, I whispered to myself. But when I looked again, the shadow was gone, swallowed by the fog. The bus kept moving, the tires crunching over what sounded like gravel. The hum returned, louder this time, vibrating through the walls. The air was thick with something metallic, like the taste of blood. I clenched my fists, trying to ground myself. But the seat beneath me felt alive, shifting subtly under my weight. The girl from earlier reappeared in the aisle, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Instead, her body convulsed, and she collapsed into the seat beside me, disappearing into the fabric like she had never existed. My breath quickened. I stood again, my knees shaking, and grabbed one of the emergency exit handles. It didn't budge. I yanked harder, but the handle broke off in my hand, crumbling into ash. The whispers turned into screams. The bus windows began to crack, thin fractures crawling across the glass like spider webs. The fog outside swirled, darker shapes forming within it. They looked like hands, pressing against the windows, trying to break through. I turned to the driver, but his head was tilted up now, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. Slowly, he turned toward me. His face was featureless, just smooth, pale skin stretched over a skull. I fell back into my seat, clutching my chest as the bus jolted again. This time it felt like we had hit something. The lights flickered, casting jagged shadows that seemed to move on their own. The boy with the notebook appeared again, standing at the front of the bus. He held the notebook high, its pages glowing faintly. As he opened it, the air grew colder, and the whispers stopped, replaced by silence so profound it hurt. The fog outside cleared for a brief moment, and I saw the school again. But this time the building was warped, its windows glowing with faint red light. The doors were open, revealing a swirling void inside. The bus stopped. The doors hissed open, revealing nothing but darkness. A cold wind swept through the aisle, carrying the faint smell of decay. I refused to move, gripping the seat tightly, but the boy walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing loudly. He stopped at the edge, turned to me, and pointed toward the darkness. "No," I muttered. "No, no, no." But the bus jolted, and I was thrown forward, landing at the boy's feet. He stared down at me, his eyes still those endless voids, and gestured again. The darkness seemed to expand, tendrils reaching out to pull me in. I scrambled back to my seat, but the bus began to change. The walls stretched and bent, the seats shifting into jagged, uneven shapes. The whispers returned, louder than ever, screaming directly into my ears. The fog poured into the bus now, wrapping around my legs and pulling me toward the open door. I clawed at the seat, my nails scraping against the metal, but it was no use. As I was dragged closer, I caught a glimpse of the driver. He was standing now, his featureless face tilted toward me. Slowly, he raised his hand and tipped his hat back, revealing nothing but a gaping maw filled with darkness. The tendrils tightened, pulling me out of the bus. The last thing I saw was the boy with the notebook, his void-like eyes staring, his lips finally moving. I fell into the darkness, the screams fading into silence. When I opened my eyes, I was back on the bus, seated where I had started. The other students were there too, their faces blank, their eyes lifeless. The driver started the engine, and the bus lurched forward again into the fog. No matter how far we drove, I knew we were always going back to the school.